all loose items in the pouch in front of you.
Have a safe and informative journey.
Hello, I'm Nathan Hartman, and this is Dreamfinders, a podcast about the creative culture of Disney theme parks. Ray Spencer found out early on that his talent as a conceptual designer could be put to use not for creating office buildings and shopping malls, but experiences. Since then, he's never looked back. With a career that spans decades of work, fleshing out ideas for places like the Field Museum in Chicago to Kennedy Space Center, Ray finally found himself an Imagineer at Disney, where he helped implement some of the biggest changes in the reimagining of California Adventure. Ray kindly sat down with me to talk about his love of trains, the creative reworking of Sunshine Plaza into Buena Vista St, and how he brought the Haunted Mansion's Hatbox ghost back from the dead. All that and more is coming right up on Dreamfinders. Ray Spencer, welcome to Dreamfinders.
Thank you, Nathan. It's great to be here.
So you spent your time at Imagineering as an executive creative director, but also for almost 2 decades, you were a freelance concept designer who worked on all sorts of projects. Did you start drawing at a very young age? Was that something that you always were interested in?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, pretty much. I mean, my father was a commercial artist, so I got a big kick out of him as a kid when I would watch him draw, and I'd see these magical things appear, and it was inspiring, and there was something about it that just seemed magical, and so I picked up the pencil at an early age and just sort of doodled and messed around and developed some kind of rudimentary skills, and then carried that forward into a career, I guess you could call it.
Where did you grow up? What area of the country?
Well, I grew up in Pasadena, California. So I've been in this area pretty much my entire life. I spent a little time in Nebraska as a kid, and I watched the corn grow there. But I'm a California native, and so this is kind of it, West Coast.
So as a California native, I always have to ask, what are your early memories of the Disney company and Disneyland and that sort of stuff? Because it's, depending on where you are in the state, it's a big state, but still it's sort of a prevalent thing even before, there were other Disney parks and that sort of stuff. Was Disneyland a part of your life growing up?
It was peripherally. It seemed like Oz to me as a kid, because I knew it was there. I went there once or twice. It wasn't often that we would go. Watching Walt on television was probably the biggest influence on me and on Sundays. And, the whole sort of Uncle Walt, the plaid couch, the whole sort of thing that a lot of people recall, Wonderful World of Color, seeing the previews of, what was coming. Some of the wonderful shows that they had. There was something very, very just homey and comforting and wonderful about Sunday evenings. Disneyland, the few times that I did go there as a kid was just, again, a magical place. And I'm glad I had some of the experience that I did have prior to, of course, getting in this industry, riding some of the classic attractions that are no longer there and having that experience. So, it was only years later as an employee that I really, got to fully understand and research the history of the company and the parks, and really sort of understand the genius of Walt's original vision and how that was carried forward.
Since you were interested in illustration and art and that sort of stuff, was being a Disney animator one of those career ideas that you had as a young age, or were you never interested in that side of the artistic form?
No, I was never interested in that side because, I think I have more of an architect's mind. So spatial relationships and forms and geometry and things like that make a lot of sense to me. But drawing action and figures has always been a little more challenging and nothing that I was really particularly good or interested in, other than just to just to convey an idea or a caricature of somebody or something like that. So not really.
Well, your background at Disney, of course, it's sort of connected with another aspect of both Disney stuff and in general, which is trains. You love trains. You're creative about trains. In fact, a past guest, Michael Campbell, suggested you to me because of your train enthusiasm. So what I think is interesting is you graduate high school and you take 3 weeks to just ride a train around with friends. Where did you end up going? What was that adventure like? That sounds like a dream to me now. I'm sure it's possible, but it just seems much more distant. What was that 3-week train excursion like?
Yeah, I had a friend who he was also a train geek, and we spent a lot of our time doing, pursuing that interest and spending, days here and days there, traveling around looking at different trains and railroads and following our hobby and our interest in that way. But yeah, we hopped on the train in LA, and we mapped out a route. Of course, back then it was mid 70s, so that was a long time ago, and that was the day of paper tickets and all that kind of stuff. So you had to do a fair amount of planning in advance. It wasn't you couldn't pick up your phone and just sort of punch in your tickets and pull up your Q codes and do that kind of thing. So, we just planned a route, wanted to travel the entire country. We strategically picked lines where we could either ride coach, which is, basically a car with a bunch of seats in it, or a sleeper where you get a roomette with beds so you could sleep. So we strategically picked routes where we could alternate to save money, but also get a decent sleep every once in a while. We picked spots where we could hop off and take a shower and do that kind of thing. And so it was awesome. It was really awesome. We met the most interesting people and had the most interesting sort of unscripted time in my life to date. So it was great. It was really a great experience for us.
So it was a train ride to look at trains. So my question's got to be when did this love of trains begin?
As a youngster, my dad influenced me. He was interested in trains. His father was a locomotive engineer on the Pennsylvania Railroad, and so he carried some of that forward. And thinking about his father and kind of the romance of the rails, it kind of got me hooked. And then being adjacent to some of the areas out here that Walt was, that Walt had access to, Griffith Park and the miniature railroad there, and the carousel there, and the things that were available to us to take advantage of. There was a lot of sort of train rail activity out here, live steamers and hobby shops and things like that. So I just gravitated toward it, and it became a kind of an interest and a passion of mine. I had to sort of tamp it down when I was in college, because I realized if I wanted any kind of a social life or any sort of a dating life, I'd have to sort of cool it, and I did. But things like that have a way of resurfacing, in your life, because it's just part of your life. So, and I think that that the commonality is that anybody who has a passion is interesting. It doesn't matter what the passion is for, but if somebody has a passion, I'm all for it. And some people it's trains, some people it's airplanes, some people it's animals, some people it's Disney, and some people it's a combination of all of those things. And the more the better, I say. One thing about being a kid in Nebraska was, if you think about Main Street at Disneyland and you think about how that was created as sort of a romanticized Marceline, Missouri, with the railroad station at the head of the street by Town Square, and think about the train as a device that back in those times you'd hop on and it would be like a magic carpet that could take you to distant places, romantic distant places that you could only dream about, and it would also bring you back safely. It was kind of like that era's magic carpet. And I think as a kid spending summers in Nebraska, we had the brick Main Street, we had the station at the head of the street, and the train would come every day, twice a day, and I could only dream about the places it was going. I'd go down to the station, watch it come and go. And so I think there was a kernel of that kind of romance that stuck with me and also translated to, Walt's original vision of Disneyland and how that device as a mode of transportation and also a mode of sort of a passport to adventure. There's a commonality there that I thought was kind of interesting and resonated with me personally.
So after that train ride, of course, you mentioned tamping that down as you went off to college. Where did you end up going to college, and what was your focus at that time?
My major was industrial design. That's designing products, toasters, waffle irons, things like that. And I went to Long Beach State University here in California, and at the time they had a very good industrial design program, and so I did that. I had a minor in architecture, and I had the ability to draw, which was good because I could create sketches of what these products might look like, even though they hadn't been built or hadn't been modeled, and that ability carried me a long way. I was never really a great artist, but I was good enough to convey an idea, and carrying that forward really helped me out with my career in entertainment and at Disney.
So you get out of college.
Yep.
And you're working. There seems to be this commonality of entertainment theme-based concepts. Was that intentional? Did you want to go in that route, or did you just sort of fall into a sphere of people who that was what they were doing, and so they needed you for those kind of projects?
Oh, well, it's interesting because when I graduated college, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do, but I had enough skills at drawing and painting that for a while I ended up just doing that for architecture firms and other outside companies that needed renderings and sketches of their products or their buildings, or things to kind of get people excited or to show people what something was going to look like before it was built. So it gave me an opportunity to kind of hone some skills in that arena. Also, I was very interested in model making, so I was building models and creating all kinds of crazy fantasy things just as another sort of hobby or outlet for my creativity at the time. And when I was in school, there was a guy who started doing some freelance work on the side, and he'd bring in these sketches, a tremendous artist in several of my classes. And you may have heard of him. His name was Joe Johnston, the guy who later became a director and did a lot of the pioneering design work for the first Star Wars movies. And he'd bring these sketches in and we'd just be blown away. And there was something about the magic of creating something that didn't really have to do anything real, like a toaster or a waffle iron, but also created a lot of entertainment and excitement, and sort of gave something back to the public in terms of vision and excitement and entertainment. There was something very interesting about that to me, and it also it seemed like a more sort of interesting, challenging, and possibly lucrative way to direct my career. So I started poking around and meeting with people and dropping off portfolios and doing things like that, just trying to get a little foot in the door, and that's kind of where I started. And
you do a lot of these little projects. You work for Knott's, you work for museums, the Field Museum in Chicago. One of my favorites that you do is your involvement in the Apollo Saturn show at Kennedy Space Center. I got to go to Kennedy not too long ago, and there's some fun stuff there, and there's just a lot of different shows, but that one sticks out for the people that have been there but not remember which show that was. It's the one where you're in mission control and you're in kind of amidst the blast, as it were. And it, for me, felt the most weirdly Disney of them all. It just, you felt really kind of in it, and I loved it. What was your involvement with that project, and how did you get connected with Kennedy?
Well, that was through a company out here in Burbank. It's called BRC Imagination Arts, and it's was founded and owned by a gentleman named Bob Rogers, who is a writer and a very creative person, and he's an ex-Disney guy, but he started this company, obviously years and years ago, and they've done a ton of stuff. If you just do a little bit of research on them, Google them. So I got involved with them through I think it was through an ex-Disney guy that I knew when I was doing some consulting at WDI, and they brought me on, and I worked on a number of projects with them. Of course, a lot of that work is project hire. You work on a project and that's it, and you're on to the next. And but with BRC, I worked on Mystery Lodge at Knott's. I worked on the Kennedy Space Center. Several others. The New Jersey Aquarium in Camden. A few others. But the great thing about them is that they're great storytellers. They care about the message. It was really fun working with great creative people who I respect very much, and that was really an honor to work with them on the Kennedy project. And the nice thing about this industry is when you work on exhibits and museums and science centers and things like that, is you get to meet the greatest, the best, and the most the most foremost authorities in these fields, and it's really an honor and very interesting. And I really appreciate the opportunity to do that kind of thing.
Were you still connected with this company when you were doing stuff for the Living Seas Pavilion at Epcot, or was this a freelance side gig for Disney?
Oh, the Living Seas. No, I worked on the Seas as an employee of Disney, because I consulted with Disney for a few years before I actually became an employee. So I worked on a number of projects. When I first started with them, they hired me to work on something for 3 weeks, and that was after a year of me kind of pestering them on a regular basis to give me a try, on anything, because I wanted to see what it was like to work for the premier company in the industry, and after having been around the horn a few times. And they started me out on a project. It was a 3-week assignment. It was at Epcot, and 3 days into that assignment, they pulled me off and put me on something else. And then a year and a half later, I was still working on stuff. And so it was a very fluid time. And during that time, I worked on quite a few projects at Epcot. The Seas may have been part of that, but my primary involvement in Living Seas was as an employee, because I went back there when we put Turtle Talk with Crush in the Seas. We put Bruce's Shark House, which is a shark exhibit. We did that, and I was the creative director on that. And then subsequent to that, they did some other development of the Seas, which I wasn't involved with, but I did spend some time with the Nemo effort back there on the Seas. Yeah.
So those early years when you're coming in and just sort of doing what they'll let you do, dipping your toe in the Disney company, seeing what the big guy is like. What was that experience like? Were you surprised what they were trying to do with Epcot at that time? I mean, it was a pretty revolutionary idea for a theme park.
Yeah, well, I wasn't involved in the initial design of Epcot. When I came in, it was established. It was it had been in existence for, I don't know, maybe 10 years, something like that. And so, all the attractions were up and running. World Showcase was up and running. My involvement was when, usually after 10 years or so, the lifespan of an attraction, it starts to get a little bit tired, and the audiences are demanding a little bit more, and you like to refresh and upgrade the things. And then of course there's corporate sponsorship. They have a certain number of years that they sign up for, and of course their messages might want to change, and you want to make sure you, especially at Epcot, you want to make sure you have a fresh message and fresh science backing it and a more contemporary look at things. So I was involved with a lot of the sort of the refresh concepts for Epcot, and sort of backing up into the early years of my time at Disney. I'll just mention something personally.
Sure.
Just like anything else, I think there's an awe and a mystery about any place that has this sort of special place that in your heart that almost seems like the Holy Grail. Well, when I went to work for Disney, I thought, oh man, I'm going to have a tough time keeping up with these guys. There's a bunch of hot shots there, and I'll be paddling as fast as I can just to keep up. And when I went to work there, I realized pretty quickly that it's just like any place else. There's very talented people, but people are people, and if you can get along with people, it really doesn't matter where you are. You find that there's people that have strengths and other people that have strengths and weaknesses in areas that are different than your own. And, I found that out pretty quickly. The same as when I went to work teaching at Art Center College out here in Pasadena. I didn't go to school there, but the reputation was of the premier art school in the country. And, again, I thought this is going to be a little bit tough for me because I'm kind of a ham and egger. I get in there, I do my job, I do it to the best of my ability, but I don't consider myself a superstar in any stretch of the imagination. But teaching at Art Center was the same thing. I mean, there's people that are really excellent at what they do, and there's people that have weaknesses as well, and like we all do. And the world is just that. It's just people. So it took me a little bit of time to kind of get over that awe and majesty of the mystique of the Disney company and some of the others. But it didn't take long for me to do that, and then I really got going.
Well, before you end up at Disney full time, doing all that you do spend some time over at New Wave or N-Wave Pictures as a production designer. And this is what I find interesting about this is I think it connects a little bit to I don't know, it's like a different side, but also when you combine kind of what you do before this and then New Wave stuff, it makes sense that Imagineering sort of is a good fit. For those who don't know, N-Wave Pictures specialized in like large format motion simulator films. So I hate to like give an example that's something you didn't work on, but probably the one people know the best. My guess would be like Back to the Future, the ride, that sort of setup. Is that correct? That sort of idea? So
basically.
You did stuff for iWorks. I mean, there were rides like Glacier Run and Devil's Mine Ride and things like that that people might remember. What was the time at New Wave? What got you interested in that technology and what did you do over there?
Well, when I started out in this business, I started early on working for a company in Culver City called ShowScan. And ShowScan was developed by Douglas Trumbull, the special effects wizard. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he won an Oscar for 2001 Space Odyssey, and he did the special effects for Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Blade Runner, just a genius, in terms of special effects and in-camera special effects. And he developed the ShowScan technology, and along with that, which was 60 frames per second, 70 millimeter film. And, what it did is it created this crystal clear realism that, we can find it in high def today, but back in the day, that wasn't something that was typical. And so along with that technology, he developed the first motion simulator bases, which were basically seats that were on hydraulic activated cylinders, and they were synced to the film. And, through that, they created, along with the ShowScan standard film, they created the motion simulator market as well, based on their technology. And so during my time there, I spent quite a bit of time working on those films and the technology behind them and how they work and how the camera point of views work. And it got my feet wet in sort of the first person point of view ride narrative, which was a good translation to the physical ride narrative, in the theme parks as well. And so My involvement with N-Wave was actually through ShowScan initially, when we did a film called Devil's Mine Ride, it had live action bookends with this CGI main film, between them, and it was successful for the company, and you could find it at casinos and places where they would install these motion simulator theaters, and it was a really good thing. I really liked that. I really liked the technology, and working with N-Wave was a lot of fun. They're based in Brussels, so I would go back and forth to Belgium, every couple months for a while, and the technology was great, and it allowed me to experiment as well. If you wanted to try some kind of a motion simulation, movement or moment where, let's say, you're going backwards through a loop, or you're spiraling through space, or you're doing something that maybe you hadn't seen before, that technology gave us the opportunity to try a bunch of different things, and some of them were successful, some of them not, but at least we had a base of information, to add to the data to help us create the most immersive experiences that we could with the technology that we had. So that was a great time and a great experience for me.
There's a quote from you from 1996 that I think is interesting to reflect on. It says, when talking about making these sort of short simulator rides, you have 4 minutes to tell your story. It unfolds in a linear way. We see them as mini dramas of 2 to 4 acts each. A backstory is essential. When you think about that, how does that translate to your time at Imagineering? Is it almost, as you mentioned earlier, that simulator to actual ride was sort of an easy transition? Does that still hold true, do you think, when you think about your time at Disney? That 4 minutes to tell a story, that unfolding in mini dramas?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, because people need to know where they are, and the better the backstory and the more complete the backstory, the more opportunities we have to use that as an armature to hang our design off of, so that the design and the storytelling is consistent. For instance, I'll just go back to Main Street for a second. If you look at Main Street, all of the buildings and the iconography of those buildings, it's all sort of turn of the century. You understand it. There's nothing incomplete or not incongruous about those designs, and people feel comfortable when they know where they are. If you plop a spaceship in the middle of Main Street, it's disorienting, and I think people get confused. And part of, at least at Disney, what we did was try to avoid that confusion. And confusion comes from storytelling that isn't cohesive. And so with motion simulation films, getting back to the 4 minutes, you have to set something up initially, and in film terms, we call it an establishing shot. It kind of tells you what your environment is, where you are, what might be happening. It kind of sets the stage for the action. And if you don't know what that stage is and you just go into action, you don't want to spend time thinking about what you're doing. You just want to accept what you're doing. So you have to set it up very quickly. And the same goes with the attractions at Disney. I did a little project at California Adventure where we converted what was the Condor Flats area, where Soarin over California and a couple of the other little attractions, there's a restaurant there and a shop. So it's kind of a mini land. At one time, it was themed around the high desert in California. It's an Air Force test base. But with the Grand Californian Hotel and the Grizzly Peak area right next to it, having this desert that's surrounded by Craftsman, High Sierra environments, and not having a way to buffer that, it didn't make sense. So we converted the Condor Flats area into what is called Grizzly Peak Airfield. So we added a bunch of trees, we painted everything brown and green, and we made it much more of a national park, High Sierra setting. And through the use of signage that's consistent with national parks, through the use of colors, through the use of every trick that we had. My goal is, I call it a frying pan approach. When people approach that area, I want to hit them over the head with a frying pan and say, "You're in a national park." Bang! And by doing the right kind of signage, the right kind of colors, the right kind of anything, that's your establishing shot. People approach the area. They say, "Oh yeah, this is national park." The establishing shot is done. They know where they are, and then once they get in there, they can enjoy it. So it's kind of like the motion simulation, 4 minutes, but you set it up. So that realization happens very quickly, and it's very complete. It's a very important part of the storytelling sequence and thing. And then to get them into the story, and then back out of the story and back to the next adventure is another, the other pieces to the puzzle.
Well, I was going to ask you about Grizzly Peak a little bit later, but I think I'll just hit you with the one question I had before we move back in time. But Brandon Clyley, who you worked with on Grizzly Peak, and who's been a guest on the show, I asked him, I said, "What do you want? What should I ask Ray about?" And he said, "Ask Ray about the Rambler Wagon. He loves that wagon." So I have to ask you about the Rambler Wagon. Why did you decide on that car, and why has it become such a popular photo spot now, do you think?
I think it's nostalgia, and for some of us, I mean, there's generations that have come after me that certainly have a different vision of nostalgia, but I think there's kind of a nostalgia to that. There was a time period in our history where I think, things were simpler. People came out of the war, World War II. There was kind of a sense of optimism and adventure. A lot of suburban sprawl where people, built houses like crazy all over the place, and people lived in these suburbs. And, the whole notion of this sort of 50s, 60s family that you'd see on Leave It to Beaver and some of those old shows, there was a sweetness to it because we didn't have, at that time near the kind of the global challenges that we seem to have today. There was of course tension left over from World War II and some of the other things, but there was kind of a naivety, and I think that family road trip became an iconic piece of business as well. That everybody hops in the station wagon and goes to a national park. It was sort of pre-computer, pre-virtual reality,
pre-Disneyland.
Basically. Well, yeah. I mean, there was something. So that Rambler, it's a 1961, so it's post-Disneyland, but that was a very popular car back then. I did some research, and I think, as a matter of fact, I think my parents may have had one. I think they had one. My grandfather had one. Everybody I talked to seemed to have somebody in the family who had one of those. So we picked the car, and we found it out in Texas, and it was bubblegum pink with black trim. We had it shipped out to California, and we had it painted in one of the, I think, 5 colors that it was available in when it first came out in 1961. We had it painted. It was I forget what the name of the color was, autumn yellow or something like that, but it's sort of a pale yellow. And then Brandon did a great job loading it with camping props, and we put a wood canoe on the top, and we really kind of tried to set the stage for this spirit of travel and adventure back in those times. And of course, Walt was on TV then, and Disneyland, of course, was already up and operating. So we had some nice Disney iconography to draw from to kind of help us there. We picked up the plaid thing. We picked up some of the early Disney Bambi, true life, nature pieces, and we did a lot of great stuff. Kind of going back and forth with the Disney thing there, but it just seemed like something that could be a great opportunity for photo ops and to help us tell our story. So that's the Rambler Wagon.
Well, and we don't go very far because one of the first projects you do at Disney full time is concept design and an art director for Soarin' over California back in 2001.
Correct.
Did your work in large format simulators, do you think, help you think about that project in a unique perspective? It's a totally different ride system, but there is something about large based projection.
Yeah, well, the thing about that is that and thanks for asking that question. That project, I started working on as a consultant, and how to kind of tell a story, and I researched, of course, Edwards Air Force Base and airplane manufacturing plants and the history of California aviation, because the park was pretty California centric at the time, at least it was supposed to be, and that was one aspect of it. The large format film, I understand it very well, and when we started, and if you do have the opportunity to watch the Imagineering story on Disney Plus, when they talk about Soarin', I don't know which episode it is. It's probably the fourth one or the fifth one, something like that. And the artwork that you see that they flash through, most of that is my artwork. There's storyboards, there's sketches, there's stuff, and I understand that stuff very well. The interesting thing, though, is that at Disney, because I was working on projects in a much different capacity, my background in that sort of attraction and my background with the big format films and motion simulation wasn't particularly well known. So I had very little to do with with that aspect of it, except that I came up with storyboard sketches and sort of suggestions of what a scene might look like. But beyond that, I wasn't that involved. My involvement was more in the physical, the theater, the pre-show, the seats, the experience of going into and out of that attraction. And once the film started, I wasn't really involved in that, but it was still an honor, and it still made perfect sense to me how that would all come together.
Well, let me ask you about that evolution of the aesthetics, I guess is the best way of putting it, around that ride. Was there early ideas that you had for Soarin' that never got kind of past the drawing board stage when it comes to the look or the feel? Or were the things you got to incorporate later at, like, I don't know, Epcot or some other place? When I started on that project, the technology hadn't particularly been developed. I'm sure you've seen, or you may have seen the erector set model of Soarin' that you've seen, and I think it's in the Imagineering story. But you see the original erector set model that the engineer came up with to explain the ride system and how it might work. When I started working on it, I don't think that had been conceived of yet. So, I think it went from could be a hang glider, where you're kind of laying horizontal with a big sort of foil type wing over you. It could be this, could be that. I don't think there was a concept yet that I recall, but that came about very quickly. And the reality of it is that with all of the hardware and the technology, it quickly shifted from you are really getting on a hang glider to you are getting on a device that simulates hang gliding, because there's no way to hide all that machinery. You've been in there, you see the huge industrial machinery that lifts you into the air. You see the seats, you see the wings. Well, that whole thing doesn't literally fly, and I don't think you could tell somebody that it literally flies. So there was a shift from you are getting on a hang glider and you are actually flying to you are getting on a sophisticated device that simulates flying. If you understand that difference, there was a shift there from one to the other, because there's no way you could tell a story and make people believe that entire device is flying through the air. It's not going to work. So, so it's a big device.
yeah, right. It's a big device. Florida, after California was built, and I worked on the Soarin in Florida, the Soarin attraction in Florida at the Land Pavilion. The challenge with that was you enter the attraction through the Land Pavilion, but the show building for the ride system is, I think it was around 300 feet away from the Land Pavilion. Mm. So it's not like you just walk through a door and you're in the attraction. You have to walk through a series of corridors to get to the attraction. And so that was a different circumstance and a different set of challenges. And in that version, you don't see the show building. You don't see the building that the theaters are housed in. At least you're not supposed to. In California, it's right there in your face, and it was themed as an aircraft hangar. So it presented a different thematic challenge too, because Condor Flats was supposed to be a high desert airfield. So you kind of understand you're flying. There's an airfield. You enter in Florida, it's nothing like an airfield. It's the Land Pavilion. So the story had to be different. So it became more of just a concourse to an attraction where you fly over the land. And so, it's kind of a loose connection, but that was thematically the difference between the version in California and the one in Florida.
Mm. In around 2001, you also, of course, while doing probably this stuff at the same time, you're also looking at Trader Sam's Enchanted Tiki Bar, which you helped create as well. And I spoke to Brandon at lengths about his involvement with that bar and all of that. Yeah. But I'm curious about kind of the origins, in the sense that he of course told me that, well, he heard about the idea and he's like, I need to get in on this and I want to do it. When did you first hear of the concept of doing a tiki bar set up at the Disneyland Resort?
Well, I got involved, and that was quite a bit later than that. I think it was, okay, I'm just sort of riffing now, but maybe 2013 or I don't know, 12. I don't know when it was. Something 13 or something like that. I'd have to look at my notes and see. But the Disneyland Hotel was renovated. It kind of went away from, it had a lot of oak in it and very dated wallpapers, and it was trying to be something that it wasn't, because it's a big monolithic. They're big monolithic towers. And so at that time, the idea was to renovate the towers and then renovate the courtyard in between all the towers. And I got involved sort of midpoint. So the towers were being renovated. The balconies were going away. They were becoming sealed. They were being painted blue and becoming much more contemporary looking. But then the question became, what happens to the rest, besides the towers, what happens to the rest of the facility? What happens to the restaurants? What happens to the convention center? What happens to the other guest areas that aren't strictly the hotel towers? What happens to the courtyard between all the towers? What happens to the restaurant Hooks Point? What happens to the pools? So that's where I got involved. And we went through a few different concepts of what that interstitial area might be and what the story is. And then eventually I did a sketch of the pools and the pool tower, which looked like the old Disneyland Hotel sign, or the Disneyland sign, with the Mark I monorails as the slides, and kind of taking a look back at early Disneyland and that kind of 50s, 60s influence. And because a lot of the buildings there were originally that, we had the opportunity to create more of that sort of throwback to not just the 50s and 60s, but 50s and 60s relaxation, which is sort of the tiki stuff. That's where the tiki stuff started coming in. So some of the ancillary structure started getting a little bit of that styling through some of the great architects that we had. And then we looked at ways to circulate people through the space so that we could take advantage of the pools and make them sort of a seamless experience. The old Hooks Point restaurant went away, and we because of age and deterioration and the desire to upgrade, the restaurant there, Hooks Point, was the idea was to reuse the foundation and anything that we could to help us build something new without having to bulldoze and start from scratch, because that sets up a lot of challenges that we didn't have the time probably or the money to do. So we started designing the restaurant there, Tangaroa Terrace, and then taking a piece of that restaurant and making a tiki bar called Trader Sam's. And I think it might have been Tom Fitzgerald who came up with the idea to do the tiki bar there. And so, great, love to do it. So we got involved with that, and I started designing the effects windows and the interior. Emily O'Brien was handling the interior design. And Brandon, of course, being a extreme Disney-phile and procurer of interesting, relevant, and obscure Disney references, he was able to just take off and run with it, grabbing the material for the props and all the interesting, little backstory, tongue-in-cheek things. And some of the stuff he did so well when we worked on Buena Vista Street, he has that Disney history and enthusiasm. He was able to really, 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 really help create that environment. And we also were able to procure some of the original props from the Adventurers Club in Florida, which was dismantled. So the ones that we couldn't save, like the ship and the bottle and things like that, we were able to recreate. We wanted to pay a little bit of homage to the Adventurers Club as well, because that was, besides being a tiki bar, we wanted a little sense of that adventure and history and personality that gave this place, because it's so small, the feeling of a place where people from around the globe and close friends could come and gather and have a drink and have a good time. And so that was kind of the genesis of that. And then I was working as the overall creative once that got going. And then, that was that.
That was that. Well, a correction is due. Thank you, typo. 2011 is when Trader Sam's happened. Yeah, opposed to 2001. I was off by a decade. But back before you do Trader Sam's, of course, you do something that's very akin to what you love, which is you get to work on the Ward Kimble Disneyland train. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How was that like? Did you get to meet Kimble at all? I mean, he was still around at that time.
Well, it's funny because he lived not too far from where I live. I mean, it's maybe a 15-minute drive, and he lived in a city called San Gabriel, California. And at the time he moved there, it was probably, I think it was the 40s, mid 40s perhaps, or late 40s. And he had some acreage there, because at that time it was all orange fields. And, he was a train enthusiast. He built his own railroad on that property called the Grizzly Flats Railroad. Walt was over at his house many times, and, he would have open houses and steam up his equipment occasionally. And I was able to get down there a couple times when that happened. I actually didn't meet him, and that was in my pre-Disney days. So all I knew, I was a train nut, and there was a guy down this, not too far from us that had this stuff that I'd heard about, I'd seen pictures of, and I was able to see it in person. But I never met him other than a handshake at one of those events. But as a fellow Disney employee and as somebody that I knew as a Disney employee, I didn't really know him. I kind of missed out on that.
Let me ask you a little thing about the train and its upkeep. One of the things that Kimble really was interested in is having a this is a little bit of a discussion people are having online. There's a Jiminy Cricket silhouette on the headlight. And the rumor,
right.
of course, has it that it was a point of discussion for Imagineers because some thought it was very un-Disney to put a cartoon character on a train, and some thought that it perfectly sort of matched kind of who Ward was, and of course that's his most legendary character. And then that was sort of the compromise, was that silhouette. Is that how the story actually goes?
Pretty much. I mean, it was probably a lot ado about not a lot, but it ended up becoming something that had some very, very vocal and passionate people on either side. And Walt had a his interest was in knowledge, education, and as well as storytelling. And so a steam train, great. I think there's something very interesting, and especially to people who would never have the opportunity to see them. I think the idea of having a steam train that wasn't steam powered but had a diesel inside of it, Walt would never agree to, because a lot of the things that Disney does is, it's all based on credibility. When we go back to storytelling, it's credibility. If it's a steam train, then it's a steam train. And if you want to see how it works, you can see it work. The Mark Twain steamboat, it's steam powered. It's got a steam engine on it. If you want to see how it works, you can see it work. There's credibility to that. And in that credibility becomes believability. And so to a guest, if you see that a story's credible in one instance, then you're going to believe that story is credible throughout. If you see the story is not credible, then you're not going to believe the credibility of your story throughout. So the example of the train, if it was diesel powered, if it had a diesel engine in the tender and it was pushing the train around, even though it was supposed to be a steam train, you're going to see it's not a real steam train. And you're not going to kind of believe the stories that you're being told. It's very subliminal and subconscious, but I believe that there's credibility to that statement. If I put a hook on the wall that, in a log cabin that's stainless steel, you're going to say that's not right. That doesn't belong in the story. If I put a hook on the wall that's wrought iron made by a blacksmith, yeah, you'll believe that story. But it's important, if I put a hook on the wall, that hook is the right hook. And so even if something doesn't have a lot of detail, the detail has to be correct for the story that you're telling. And so the headlight story, just getting back to that now, steam trains back then had scenes painted on the side of their headlights. At least a lot of them did. It might be a picture of a moose or a waterfall, or a person or something. But a lot of early steam trains had those scenes on the side. So a picture of Jiminy Cricket isn't consistent with that story. It's a picture and it's Jiminy Cricket, but it kind of, the debate was, does this start to get into kind of a fantasy land? And does anybody really care? I don't know if anybody really cares. Does anybody really care about that? But I think there's something that kind of has the potential to take you out of the story if you're a stickler for that. But Ward had there was a sketch circulated that was a picture of Jiminy Cricket on the side of a headlight, and I think it may have been Ward's sketch. There wasn't a name on it, but I did see it, and so I just made the decision to do the silhouette. I mean, it kind of stopped with me, but I thought, here's a guy who's done all this, and he's been very instrumental in, of course, a legend and a railroad enthusiast, and great influence and friend with Walt, and just an amazing person. And Jiminy Cricket, I love Jiminy Cricket, but I felt like, to sort of honor the person and yet not be so over the top. That might be a nice way to do it. And some people are okay with it, some people aren't. It's just an art director's decision, and those happen all the time. And that's part of life.
Hey, it's the least we can do for Ward Kimble, I tell you.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, let's talk about another thing that is a massive project that you were part of, and it does deal in that we were talking about earlier of sort of getting the details right, and that is Buena Vista Street. And of course you led sort of the charge on Buena Vista Street. But before we get into Buena Vista Street, I want to talk a little bit about Sunshine Plaza.
Sure.
It seems like the consensus is, and I would say it's the consensus in even the Imagineering story, is that Sunshine Plaza just didn't work. Along with many other aspects of the park, things just didn't seem to gel. Internally at Imagineering, was that sort of, it seems like there was a time of self-reflection going on when talking about how to fix what California Adventure just didn't seem to get right on its first pass. Was that sort of the environment?
There was an environment like that. I don't think it was universal. I think there was kind of a smaller sub group of people kind of thinking and feeling that way. I think we all knew in our hearts and souls that wasn't working. But there was a conceit that what wasn't working, and that was, look, when DCA 1 opened, there were no Disney characters. Visual intrusion was okay. You could see from one land to the other, to the outside of the park. That's okay. There was a whole set of precepts to do things differently and less expensively. And obviously, that wasn't the way to go. And there's ways to fix it. And I don't know if you'd like me to follow up on that, but I have some thoughts about
sure,
it.
Of
if
course.
You'd like to hear them.
Well, I would, of course, I would. This is what I would love to hear. This is why you're here.
Well, I think that when I've talked to people about Disneyland and about Main Street, I've had people from all different walks of life come up to me and tell me their story, and those stories are really interesting, and some of them are very, emotional. I've had people tell me that when the first time they were on Main Street was the first time they felt safe in their entire life. Or the first time they're on Main Street is the first time they felt like they were home. And I think there's something about the comfort and safety of home, and Main Street delivers. Main Street is predictable. It is what it is. There's a comfort and a security to that device to settle you in your home, and like Walt's childhood home, it gets you grounded for the rest of your activities. And when I talk about being grounded, I mean feeling like you know where you are and you know what's going on, and you can always come back to this place. And it's home. DCA 1 did not have that DNA, and that DNA is a part of every Disney park and should be. DCA 1 did not have that. When you walk into it, you're looking at tile walls. You're looking at a abstracted Golden Gate Bridge. You're not seeing anything you're familiar with. It's kind of, in a more sort of serious and comforting way. It's kind of discordant, and then you see the Sunshine Plaza, and you're not particularly home. You're not anchored or grounded. It didn't have it. It did not have it, and that was alarming to me. And frankly, it bothered me from the get-go. So, and I don't think I'm alone in that.
Well, one of the big changes, of course, with Buena Vista was the red car trolley. And you were someone who rode the last red car line in the 60s, right?
Yeah, that's right.
It's sort of tangential to trains, but it also is, it's sort of its own thing. What makes you love trolleys so much?
Well, I don't know if I love them so much, but it was 1961, and I barely remember this. My father took me down and took me on that last red car line, and I just remember, because as a really young kid, you don't your memory's kind of in snippets, and I remember a lot of noise. I remember a lot of, the car was run down, and it felt like you were riding in a big bucket of bolts. I remember that. I remember that. But when you think about what that Pacific Electric system was in its heyday, it was 1,000 miles of track. It went from the beaches to the mountains to the desert, million riders a day. I mean, this was a huge system that was part of everybody's life back in those times, and it really kind of opened up the Southern California area. And in fact, when Walt Disney came out to California from Kansas City in 1923, he took the Santa Fe Railroad, and he arrived at their station in Los Angeles, which was called the La Grande Station. Union Station in LA hadn't been built yet. So Santa Fe had their own station called the La Grande Station. And the first thing that he would do would be, and this is I'm just guessing, because this is pretty much what everybody else would do. I can't speak to Walt personally, but the first thing they would do is exit the station and hop on a trolley and go to wherever they're going. And so that was part of the transportation. And if the story of Buena Vista Street was, this is Los Angeles when Walt arrived in 1923. We basically took the time period 1923 to the premiere of Snow White in 1937, and used icons from that time period on that street. And the trolley was a big piece of that. It's a big piece of how people move around. And if you think about Tomorrowland and Disneyland, the kinetics of transportation, was a big piece of that, the park back in the early days, and still is to some degree. So we felt that would be a fitting way to give people an opportunity to kind of sense the street, how it might have been, and also gives them a little ride, on the trolley. And so that was a big piece of business for us.
Let me ask you about sort of one of the I guess another photo op that you're known for, but it's part of Buena Vista Street, which is of course Storytellers, the Storyteller statue with Walt and Mick. Of course, it is sort of a reflection in the sense that the other partner statue is just across the way at Disneyland. What was the unique challenge about doing something different? And of course, it clearly is now, but I imagine that was a lot of conversation on making not only choices about where they stand, and because they're the opposite of where they are in the other statue, and that sort of thing, but where it should go and that sort of things. What was that conversation like? Well,
it's actually an interesting question. I appreciate you asking it. If you look at partners over in Disneyland, that statue is in a planter. It's up on a pedestal, and it's Walt as a older Walt, and he's kind of saying by his hand gesture, I've brought this, I've given you this, and this is my legacy to you. It's kind of a past tense. We're honoring him in a statue, but in a way that is honoring his achievements. Mm-hmm. When Walt came to California, of course, like you said, the statue is an amalgam. Mickey hadn't been developed yet. He arrived with a suitcase and $40 in his pocket. But we wanted Mickey to be a piece of that. but the important thing too was to give people a picture of Walt as a younger man, and one who was coming with dreams and aspirations that hadn't been fulfilled yet. But I think in a way, and I've explained this over and over again to various people in various groups. I think there's a piece of that in all of us, and my goal with that statue was to help reinforce that story that, hey, if you can dream it, it means that it's possible. Because Walt was dreaming, he was scrambling, he was dreaming, he was always kind of reaching for the next thing and thinking and innovating, but he hadn't really succeeded yet. He came with, like they said, a suitcase and a dream. And so thinking about that, thinking about the statue, and my first sketches of the statue, of course, like I said, I'm not a caricature artist, so they were very crude to say the least, but they conveyed the idea of the suitcase and the man. And it took Rick Terry, the sculptor, to take a crude, what I would call a crude sketch and make it something beautiful with the action, the pose, and the details. But regardless of that, if you're saying that this is a young man who's arrived in California with a suitcase and a dream, you can't put him on a pedestal and a planter, because that is saying that you're looking back on him. But we weren't saying that we're looking back on him when we did the statue. We're with him in 1923 or 1937 or 1928, when Mickey was born. We're with him. So that's why I wanted to put him on the ground, on the street corner, and have him approachable and touchable by guests, so that he is one of us, meaning the guests, and the guests are one of him. And if you have a dream, it's achievable. He had a dream, it's achievable. But we're all kind of in this sort of dream thing together. And so my goal was to make the story become more seamless between our guests and Walt Disney, and make our community feel a little bit bigger and better that way, if that makes any sense.
Of course.
Yeah. And we had to go through a lot of, there was a lot of sort of politics and discussion about accessibility to the statue and whether that's a good thing, and can we put a fence around him and blah, blah, blah. But, we couldn't, at least in terms of maintaining the concept. So we didn't, and I think it's worked out pretty well.
We're slowly finishing up here, but let's finish up a little bit with another icon that is weirdly enough not an icon that people knew a lot of, or they knew a lot about, but they didn't see a lot of, which is of course the Hatbox Ghost, which you helped bring to life. I guess one of my questions for you about the Hatbox Ghost is, did you have any idea at all how passionate Haunted Mansion fans were until you started working on this project?
No, I wasn't actually. I'd heard about the Hatbox Ghost, and I was at our WD offices in Anaheim, and I was talking to a couple people there, and one in particular, and he said, yeah, there's online communities, there's fan sites, there's this, there's that, and I got involved in that. The idea was already circulating, so I just got involved because I was working on 3 projects at the time in Anaheim, and I think they thought by getting a package deal they could get me on that, as well as we added some new scenes to the Matterhorn and put in some new animatronics in the Matterhorn, and we were also doing the Grizzly Peak Airfield at the time. So all 3 of those were going on simultaneously for me. But getting back to the Hatbox Ghost, I really didn't have any idea. I didn't know it was such a subject of enthusiasm and discussion and debate, and seeing online petitions to bring him back, and you know, it was really eye opening and very interesting. And you know, we had some very, very, very passionate people working on that project as well. So that was a lot of fun. I mean, my involvement was not just the ghost, but creating the environment for the ghost, because we had to create a scene for him to reside in that was, once you leave the attic scene in Haunted Mansion and look out over the graveyard, we had to create a little spot there for him that it had a covering, it had some props, you know, and it created its own little scene that wasn't visible from any other place in the attraction. So staging him and you know, creating the proper environment for him to be seen, and also you know, we had to manipulate how the doom buggies were oriented toward the figure so you could see the transition from Hatbox to head. And you know, there's a bunch of logistics that goes into that. And so you know, it was a fun project, and then keeping it a secret was also a lot of fun too.
You are quoted as saying that the hardest part about the project was not the darkness but the light, because you were concerned while putting it in and installing him and getting it figured out, the ride was still operating daily, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So we had a little temporary scene that we put in there. We had a flat that was painted black, and it had a window in it with this lenticular. It's a lenticular image. A lenticular is one of those things where, you know, you see them. They're usually like a plastic, you know, on plastic with a bunch of little ridges on it. And when you tilt it from one side, you see one thing, and you tilt it the other side, and you see another thing. You know, those little. That's called a lenticular. So we did a little lenticular scene of I don't know, vulture or something. I don't know. It was a vulture on a some kind of a pylon or something. I forget what they called it, but anyways, you see them in the load area of the Haunted Mansion. It's a little stanchion with a bird on it, and the bird kind of flies away. But it didn't work really well. But it was just something to kind of close off what we were doing and create this transition. And people commented on it online, like, "What's that weird thing that's there?" But but it never really worked. It was just you know, just this fun little thing, and then you know, then it opened up, and that was that. But Daniel Joseph did the special effects on that. And he's a special effects whiz. He's a MacGyver of special effects, and a big disciple of Yale Gracie. Just a great guy. And so we were really lucky to do that. And the figure was built in-house, so it was precious. It was precious to a lot of us, and it was an honor to work on that.
You also have done work in both Tokyo and Shanghai.
Yep.
My question is less about those projects, but more about the culture of consuming a park in those different countries. Now, they're very much different societies and different cultures altogether, but what surprised you about both? Well, I mean, when trying to think about storytelling, it's a very visual medium anyway, but what's it like when you have to transfer things into a different language and think about it in a way that a different culture will see it with their eyes?
That's a great question. Shanghai was different for me because I only worked on one facility there, and it's a restaurant called the Wandering Moon Tea House. And really, the theme of it is the 7 different geographical regions in China, but very, very, very loosely based. There's the ocean and the desert and the mountains, and so we pick a theme from each sort of geographical feature of China, and then focus. We had 7 different dining rooms, and each one has a focus on an aspect of China in that regard. You know, for us, and it was sort of remote for me because most of my work was done in the U.S. First of all, it was an odd challenge because asking me to do that is probably like asking somebody from, I don't know where, but you know, the heart of China to design a Western town. I mean, it was not a Western ghost town in the U.S. it's not something I'm particularly familiar with. And so we had a great architect who spent years in China, fluent Chinese speaker, very well immersed in their culture, who was able to really kind of exercise that. And then we had scholars, we had Chinese scholars, we had Chinese people from Chinese cultural institutes involved. It became kind of a lightning rod of what is this and how is this going to fit. And so for me, it was a little bit less obvious of a storytelling effort because it wasn't really based on a fictitious story. But I do think that we had our challenges over there with introducing that society to the Disney culture. For instance, what I would call their main street over there is, I think it's called Mickey Avenue. It's not similar to what we have over here. It's not a Victorian main street, what we have at our Disney parks in the U.S. It's kind of a hybrid between a main street and a Toontown, because the characters live in their main street, Mickey Avenue. That's where they live. That's where they work. Mm-hmm. So to people that are used to the U.S. parks, it's very different because it's not orienting itself in what we assume a Disneyland is going to be or feel like. But in terms of orienting the citizens and the society to the Disney culture, that was this decision that was made. So it's a much different thing. And I don't have a lot more experience other than that. I didn't really spend time there. I didn't spend a lot of time besides working with our representatives that had been working with the Chinese cultural institutes and experts. I was just taking that information and filtering it. So, Tokyo is a different story because the company that owns Tokyo Disneyland and Tokyo Disney Sea, Oriental Land Company, mm-hmm. they wanted a Disney park. They want Disney, and they want Disney the way it is here. They're not interested in creating a Japanese version of Disneyland. They're creating a Disneyland. And so they're different in that regard. And also, they really want to do things first rate, and it it's an honor and a pleasure working them. I didn't work on the Tokyo stuff for too long. Matter of fact, the last stuff I worked on for Disney is now being completed, if it's not completed, over at Tokyo Disneyland, and it hasn't opened yet to the public because of the COVID-19, but we'll see it. I worked on Tomorrowland and New Fantasyland and a couple other things, so it'll be fun to see those things when they open. Really great society and great people, and I really enjoyed my experience working on that portfolio.
So let me ask you now that you, as you mentioned, that was some of your last work for Disney, and now you're sort of doing creative consultant stuff for hire. But does that mean you now have more time to invest in your model trains? What's keeping you busy now?
Yeah, well, that's kind of it. I mean, I left Disney in late 2016. I had an opportunity to, at the time, take I guess they'd called it an early retirement, and I did. So, my trains, painting, and then I've got a few projects. I've got a little theme park project I've been working on, and then some other commercial development stuff. And so, it's kind of a rounded experience. It's different than corporate. The corporate world, that's for sure. But I'm really enjoying my time now, and I'm really enjoying the opportunity now to reflect and talk to people like yourselves and others about some of the experiences I've had. And no, it's all good.
Well, Ray Spencer, thank you so much for coming on Dreamfinders. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's an honor. Thank you so much, Nathan.
And that's it for this episode of Dreamfinders. Thanks so much to Ray Spencer for chatting with me. Dreamfinders is edited by Shannen Michaelsen and quality control by Ben Harris. It's hosted and produced by yours truly, Nathan Hartman, who you can follow on Twitter at SomeStuffISaid. Our podcast artwork is provided by JP Tanner. Find his other work at tanwoodcreative.com. This podcast is distributed by WDW News Today, the worldwide leader in Disney Parks news. Read all they have to offer at WDWNT.com. Tell your friends about the show, and please give us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. And if you or someone else you know would make a great guest on this program, feel free to email us at dreamfinders@WDWNT.com. I'm Nathan Hartman, and remember, if we can dream it, then we can do it.